Hello everyone and good evening. Welcome back to our lecture series on literature, literary criticism and theories particularly. And if you remember, we are discussing on these many details, keeping in mind the preparation for the NET examinations particularly. And based on those very details, we are here to highlight on a few of the other prominent factors that remain, as a significant one particularly. Fine. So if you remember, we have started talking about the literary criticism and theory, particularly. Okay, and now when we talk particularly about literary criticism and theory, let me clear you that we have talked about the classical period, right? And we also have now we are about to go on ending with, in a way, we can say, right, the age of neoclassicism and enlightenment. Okay. Now, in that, if you remember, uh, two of the prominent figures are yet to be discussed particularly. So, we have talked about. By the way, we are discussing about literary criticism and theories, and within that, literary criticism and the various theories that have been there developed by many prominent critics, particularly. And in our yesterday's lectures, in the previous lecture series, we have talked about all the lecture series. We started with the classicals, the Greek Romans. We have also had a revision of those things, those prominent figures from those classical literatures, particularly, in which we try to find out their works and all those things. So when we had a revision of all those things, particularly, if you remember, we talked about the Greek and Roman classics and the kind of a pathway put forth by those prominent figures in the field of literary criticism in the contemporary era, particularly, right? We talked about that too. And now we talked about some prominent figures in the medieval age, and then we talked about Renaissance and its impact on the critics that were existing in the Renaissance era. Now, okay, and since last few lectures, we have been talking about the prominent critics in neoclassical and Enlightenment age, particularly neoclassicism and the Enlightenment age, in which we have focused. We have talked about. We have talked about the greatest of the contributions by John Dryden, then Philip Sidney, James Johnson. Then again, who poorly highlights themselves in the age of Augustine, particularly. The prominent figure we have with us is Alexander Pope and Dr. Samuel Johnson. Right now, in today's session, particularly, in a way, we are going to cover the remaining part that we were discussing in our previous lecture is about the prominent figure is uh, Alexander Pope. Okay, and another prominent figure is Dr. Samuel Johnson. Okay, and later on, if time permits, okay, significantly, as we have talked about classicism, neoclassicalism, we will also talk about the one of the prominent notable period in English literature, and so the prominent figure in literature criticism is that held from Romanticism, particularly, right? So these are the two to three prominent figures that we have been discussing pretty finely about their contribution, their greatest kind of work that they have done, and the kind of noteworthy people they stand, particularly when it comes to understand their literature, right? So तुम्हाला आठवत असेल तर आपण कालच्या लेक्चरमध्ये अलेक्झांडर पोप कोण आहेत आणि अलेक्झांडर पोपचं कॉन्ट्रीब्युशन काय आहे याची आपण थोडीशी माहिती घेण्याचा प्रयत्न केला. आपण डिटेल त्यांच्या वेगवेगळ्या कॉन्ट्रीब्युशन बद्दल आपण बोलत आहोत. तर let's resume back and discuss about the prominent neoclassical figure or the greatest of the proponent of neoclassical figure, Alexander Pope. So in yesterday lecture, if you remember, आपण जर आपण काल बघितलं तर we have also tried to focus on who was no, particularly Alexander Pope, what his contribution is when no, the in a way when it comes to define Pope's work, he cannot be called as a typically a system builder, particularly like Aristotle, Longinus, or Dryden. But he wrote his criticism in a rhyme format and in footnotes or prefaces or sometimes in marginalia. But above all, or after all, in the practice of poetry itself, okay, so he remains a man with a completely different test, particularly. In a way, the performance, the criticism performance, or the performing criticism can be seen with his writings, particularly. So he remains kind of a notable person in the neoclassical age, particularly hailing from Augustan era, right? So he being one of the prominent figures, we have seen his two or three of the notable works, particularly the one his an essay on criticism, and then the other one we have his idea of criticism, particularly. So his criticism that he tried to put forth through his poetry. Then the translation work of Homer's greatest, so we have talked about that also, and then his ideas or his explanation on what Shakespeare had particularly tried to state. Okay, so this remains particularly very much prominent in a way. So when we try to find out the accountability of Pope's contribution in English literature, particularly, it is quite important to understand the three terms that remain quite cardinal and that arises from his long tradition, particularly, where he highlights particularly where we find Pope greatly focusing on the idea of nature. Okay, so we also tried to understand yesterday what nature actually means for him. So it is not just only a kind of a wilderness, but in a way normative order, right? Which is governed by reason and which is refined by long experience, particularly, and it recognizes everything as universal, particularly. So when he claims people, the contemporary writers to follow nature, in a way we find him he in a way provoking or propagating to a rational, a kind of rational that is shared, a standard rather than mere spontaneity, right? So whatever has been written over here, he's within an expectation that okay, so जो भी कुछ लिखा जा रहा है, जो भी कुछ कहा जा रहा है, म्हणजे जे काही सांगितलं जाते, लिहिलं जाते, किंवा जे काही लिटरेचरमध्ये सब्जेक्ट टॉपिक म्हणून सिलेक्ट केले जाते, या सगळ्यामध्ये सगळ्यात महत्त्वाचं काय आहे तर नेचरला फॉलो करा. ही इज गायडिंग दी पर्टिक्युलरली ही दिस वर्क ग्रेटली कॉन्ट्रीब्युट्स टू द इंग्लिश लिटरेचर अँड लिटररी क्रिटिसिझम ओनली बिकॉज पोपने यामध्ये फक्त पोएम्स किंवा कुठल्याही लिटररी फॉर्म बद्दल न सांगता क्रिटिसिझम आणि जजमेंट म्हणजे काय पर्टिक्युलरली, आणि त्यानंतर क्रिटिक्सचा रोल काय काय हे सगळं यामध्ये दिसतं, आणि म्हणून त्याच्या अँड एसे ऑफ क्रिटिसिझम हा एक सगळ्यात मोठा फॅक्टर आहे, राईट. नंतर तो रूल्स बद्दल बोलतो. रूल्स बद्दल सांगताना काय सांगतो अलेक्झांडर पोप इथे, तर त्याचं त्याचं म्हणणं आहे की रूल्स आर नॉट आर नो इन अ वे जस्ट कमांडमेंट्स और सेट ऑफ सम प्रिन्सिपल्स टू बी ऑब्झर्व्ड इन अ वे, राईट. So he says particularly that they are the one that distill the practice of great authors, particularly, and he is of opinion that rules when that internal logic that logic works, particularly, they codify the excellence and not judgment, particularly. So your excellence put in a proper rule or in a proper manner makes it resulting into kind of a great creativity, right? So when creativity has a set of rules, particularly, and finally we find him discussing about wit, right? So a satire or an ability to point out the trivial factors which have got kind of a great prominence in society has to be highly implemented. म्हणजे समाजामध्ये as literature is a reflection of society itself, whatever the social issues have been there, okay, so the style of him by using heroic couplet and putting forth the ideas or the social misplacement in a satirical way makes him a kind of a great author, particularly, right? So and he also talks about now the fourth concept which we have not mentioned clearly here, but he talks about test, right? So uh, he is of opinion that a critic, not just a critic, but also the author have to have the test, particularly. Now, when he says test means they are expected to refer the Roman classics, Greek classics, and a kind of a classical work produced in the contemporary era or in a prior to them. Okay, who remains them kind of a seniors. So he's of opinion that की तुमचे जे सिनियर्स आहेत, तुमच्या अगोदरचे जे ऑथर्स होते, त्यांनी जे काही क्लासिकल लिहिलेलं आहे, त्या क्लासिकल वाचा, त्या क्लासिकलच्या वाचण्यातून तुम्हाला कसं लिहावं याची आयडिया पण डेव्हलप होईल आणि तशा प्रकारचं क्वालिटी क्रिएटिव्ह लिटरेचर तुमच्याकडून प्रोड्यूस होईल. त्यामुळे ऑथरला नेचर, रूल्स, विट आणि त्यासोबत टेस्ट या चार गोष्टींची जाण असणं गरजेचं आहे. अशा प्रकारचं एक स्ट्रॉंग ओपिनियन इकडे आपण याला करताना बघतो. टॉकिंग अबाउट हिज एसे ऑन क्रिटिसिझम पर्टिक्युलरली, तर या या एसे ऑफ क्रिटिसिझमचं काय महत्व आहे, तर हा पर्टिक्युलरली जेव्हा अलेक्झांडर पोप अवघ्या 20 वर्षांचा होता, when he was just 20 years old, he tried to put forth his ideas on criticism, and in a verse format, in a poetic manner, he wrote this essay particularly, which is divided into three sections particularly, in which he talks about the criticism particularly, then judgment, and then he talks about the duties, or in a way how a critic should be particularly, right? So he we find him, severely criticizing, the partiality, then the pride, or in a way otherwise the pedantry and the tyranny of fashion particularly. So he complains that the critics mistakes fragments for a whole, right? So एखाद्या छोट्या गोष्टीवरून अख्ख्या पूर्ण होलला क्रिटिसाइज करणं, म्हणजे लेस टेस्टवरती. फॉर एक्झाम्पल, देर आर 10 व्हॉल्यूम्स, and instead of going through all the 10 volumes, you just read one or two volume and you make your opinion about the entire writing work itself, is something that we find Alexander Pope greatly rejecting over here. So his contribution makes definitely a kind of a difference particularly, but understanding what kind of level he wants us to achieve when it comes to deal with handling the literature or literary pieces to express your extreme amount of creativity particularly, right? So he says that the errors, मग त्याचं ओपिनियन काय आहे की अशा एरर्स कुठून तयार होतात, they are originating from the disproportion. It is due to the overgrowth of technicality, without the test, or enthusiasm without rule, right? You are extremely curious to put down your literature, but you don't know the rule, you don't know the form, you don't know the kind of a quality you are expected to possess. So this kind of particular thought has greatly spread in the neoclassical thought, right? निओक्लासिझमचा पगडा जर का आपण बघितला ना, तर निओक्लासिझमचा बेसच हा मूलतः क्लासिकल आयडियाजला पुन्हा आणणं, रिगेनिंग द क्लासिकल आयडियाज, रिगेनिंग द क्लासिकल क्वालिटी, referring to the classical art, referring to the classical literature that has been produced. So this kind of thought process is greatly developed there, and so we find them very prominent particularly, right? त्यामुळे त्यांचं काम जास्त काय म्हणायचं त्याला, न्यू क्लासिकल एरामध्ये सगळ्यात जास्त प्रकाश कशावर दिसतो, सगळ्यात जास्त हायलाइटिंग इफेक्ट्स कुठले आहेत, तर हेच आहेत माहिती का, की रोमन, ग्रीक, लॅटिन, जे काही रोमन आणि ग्रीक जे काही क्लासिक्स होते, त्या क्लासिकला रेफर करा आणि त्याच्या आधारे तुमचं नवीन लिटरेचर बनवा. आणि मग त्यामुळे त्याने त्याच्या एसेमध्ये तर सांगताना अशा प्रकारच्या गोष्टी सांगितल्या. तो म्हणतो की मूलतः प्राईड, मग पार्शलिटी किंवा अशा प्रकारचं लो क्वालिटी लिटरेचर का तयार होतं, तर ते तयार होण्यामागून असतं की ओव्हर ग्रोथ कॉन्फिडन्स, your way to fondness for the technicality without the test, and also sometimes the extreme amount of excitement without following the rules. This could be one of the reasons that he states, and this literally happens due to that which he said. Now he talks about positive doctrine, in which we can say that, where we have seen again previously that he has greatly followed the idea of nature, that is, follow the nature, follow the rules, and be a bit of witty otherwise, right? So these are the prominent doctrines that we find him discussing over here, very prominently, where we find him stating that he advises the authors, okay, reading of the ancients not as a servile imitation but as a apprenticeship. सो जेव्हा म्हणजे कुठलंही काम सुरू, म्हणजे इथं आता इथं काय म्हणायचं त्याला दिसतंय, टू रेफर टू से व्हॉट ही हॅज बीन सेड हिअर, येस दॅट ही सेज दॅट रेफर टू दी, सॉरी, we find him saying that refer to the ancient, not servile imitation but as apprenticeship. जेव्हा तुम्ही जुन्या कुठल्या तरी कामाला रेफर करताय, when you are referring to the old classical literature, old classical written tragedies, poems, or the compilation of poems, your approach while reading to them, while reading them should not be only just a kind of an imitation. So you will get an idea of how to produce a kind of a literature. Okay, you shouldn't be only learning imitation, but your idea with the purpose should be that how a style matters the most, how its a quality matters the most, kind of a content it has been delivered, and then in a way how judicially it has been written. So kind of a thing we find Alexander Pope strongly propagating over here. So he talks about decorums, okay, and the fitness of style to the subject that governs all. In a way. So decorum म्हणजे काय तर the way we have seen, particularly the classics, Longinus, Horace, Aristotle, prominently. In a way, Horace and Longinus prominently talking about the subject matter, the language, the style should be in a coordination with each other. Particularly, that makes kind of a great difference. So इथे आपल्याला काय दिसतं तर तो म्हणतो की स्टाईल, लँग्वेज, प्रत्येक कॅरेक्टरच्या रोलला सुटेबल असणारी लँग्वेज, ऑडियन्सला सुटेबल असणारी लँग्वेज, त्याचे थीम्स, त्या रोलला किंवा त्या स्टोरीला अलाइनिंग असणारे कॅरेक्टर्स, त्याचा ॲप्रोप्रिएटनेस, या सगळ्या गोष्टी जपलेल्या हव्या. म्हणजेच काय तर एक प्रॉपर डेकोरम फॉलो केलेला असावा. A kind of opinion we find in a way Alexander Pope making over here. So we also find him insisting on use of three unities: the unity of time, unity of place, and unity of action. Right, and where the literature that has been provided should have a kind of a great proportion, it should have a kind of a clarity, and he also recommends patience. Okay, so he says that when it comes to take the test, when it comes to follow the doctrine of having a test of the ancient classical literature, where we find him phrasing in a quite a better way by Alexander Pope, that he says ki a little learning is dangerous thing, drink deep or taste not the Perian spring. Brevity should not no turn get sense, or ornament should not eclipse truth. In a way that when it comes to decorate, your extreme amount of decoration in an excitement may lose the quality of the work. Okay, so it should be governed by the rules, and your over technicality should be governed by the test. Particularly, your over technicality can result into success when you have a kind of a greater test. It means you have read enough amount of classical literature that allows you to come up with kind of a great creativity. This makes kind of a sense. Otherwise, that's what he wants to state here particularly. So he highlights that also, and we also find him defining the ethics of criticism particularly. Right, for Alexander Pope, criticism is kind of a moral and social thing particularly. Okay, and so we find him defining the various duties of a critic. Right, that a critic should be candor, he should be he should be modest, and a kind of he should have a good temper. Right, he also says that a critic should be able to do things in a satirical way, but the satire that he is using should be used to serve corrections and not to malice particularly. Right, and the critic, he wants the critic to be a bit teachable. That is, that means the critic should be willing, to revise the judgments and grateful to be corrected particularly. So when there are corrections provided, okay, the critic has to have this idea particularly that की त्यांनी ते corrections wholeheartedly accept करावे, openness असावा, जेणेकरून त्याच्या कामामध्ये सुद्धा जे कोणी करेक्शन सांगतायत त्या करेक्शन सांगण्यामध्ये एक प्रॉमिनंटली एक काय म्हणायचं त्याला ॲक्सेप्टन्स हवा, की ज्या करेक्शन मधनं स्वतःला अपडेट ठेवण्याची वृत्ती थोडीशी त्यामध्ये डेव्हलप होती. राईट, the poem form or the verse form in which this essay of criticism is written, it is written in heroic couplet which comprises of a iambic pentameter particularly. Right, and this makes it kind of a great work particularly. Right, so मग त्याने कुठलं कुठलं काम केलेलं आहे particularly. uh, in his Rape of Lock, we find him using the satire as a critical instrument particularly. Right, so this Rape of Lock is a mock epic, it's a mock heroic epic particularly, that criticizes the manners by test, by elevating a tribal quarrel into epic machinery. अतिशय क्षुल्लक गोष्ट आहे, पण ते क्षुल्लक विषय त्याने इतक्या फिगरेटिव्हने हँडल केलेला आहे ना, की समाजामध्ये जे चाललं होतं की अक्षरशः छोट्या छोट्या गोष्टींना किंवा ज्या मिनिंगलेस गोष्टी आहेत त्यांना विनाकारण ग्लोरीफाय करणं, किंवा अशा प्रकारचे जे काही त्याला कंटेम्पररी एरामध्ये सोशल स्टाटामध्ये ज्या काही हायलाइटिंग पॉईंट दिसले त्यांना पॉइंट आउट करणाऱ्या गोष्टी इथे हिरोइक कपलेटमध्ये यांना लिहिलेल्या दिसतात particularly. So this poem examines how a culture mishandles value. It lavishes epic apparatus on a lock of hair, so thereby exposing the disproportion between means and ends in a polite society. Right, so what you aim particularly, what kind of mediums you use, how simple, So whatever it is to be done, it has to be done in a classical way, particularly. So the class has to be maintained. When the class has not been maintained by over here, we find and the way the society had taken this particular thought in their mind that all जो क्लासिझमला सोडून चाललेला एक समाज होता ना, तर तो क्लास मेंटेन ठेवणारा समाज आपल्याकडे हवा, अशा प्रकारच्या थॉट प्रोसेसमधून वी फाइंड Alexander Pope particularly explaining his idea, right? And so it is with the Rape of Locke. So we find him again stating a kind of a same thing when it comes to talk about the Dunciad too, right? Dunciad तर अतिशय एकदम चांगली पोएम आहे ज्यामध्ये तो जे आविर्भावात वावरणारे रायटर्स आहेत किंवा असे एक सगळे जे काही मिथ्या लेखक आहेत, मिथ्या कवी आहेत, त्या सगळ्यांना तो सिव्हिअरली क्रिटिसाइज करताना दिसतो, राईट. So he treats, he treats hack writers, puffers, and mercenaries critics as the agents of culture entropy. So the goddess of dullness presides over a kingdom where judgment sleeps and noise replaces a sense. So in a way, we find him defining those many ideas in a very severe way, particularly. Further, we have his another work that is of a translation. You know, it's the kind of a great contribution where he had tried to translate the work by Homer, right? And particularly the Homer's Odyssey, okay, with the help of Brumam Fenton particularly. So this translation for Pope is not in a way mechanical fidelity, but an energetic equivalence that captures the poem's spirit, pace, and tonal decorum, particularly for an English audience accustomed to the couplet, particularly. So we find him negotiating the tension between exactness and elegance, frequently preferring idiomatic clarity and rhythmic propulsion of a strict literalism. So जेव्हा जेव्हा हे ट्रान्सलेशनचं काम त्याच्याकडे आलं होतं तेव्हा जेव्हा त्याने हे ट्रान्सलेशनचं काम पर्टिक्युलरली हाती घेतलं, तर त्या फेजमध्ये आपण इकडे सहजरित्या बघू शकतो की कशा आधारे म्हणजे कशा रीतीने त्याने या कामाला चांगल्या प्रकारे न्याय दिलेला आहे. तो म्हणजे काय, तर इडिओमॅटिक एक्सप्रेशन जे असतात, फ्रेझल एक्सप्रेशन जे असतात, त्यांना त्या भाषेतून अक्षरशः या भाषेमध्ये आणताना त्याच्यामध्ये कुठेही काटछाट न करता किंवा त्याच्यामध्ये कुठेही अर्थ न म्हणजे विदाउट लुझिंग द मिनिंग. He's a kind of a this is literally a skillful thing that he has done, that without losing a meaning he has tried to translate and maintain the decorum or maintain the contextual references of those dialogues when it came to refer when it came to translate that particular work by Homer, okay. And you know so in a way his idea, right? So what we find him, his extensive prefaces and notes display comparative philology, interpretive synthesis, and judgments about the epic structure. Even critics who fault his augustinizing of Homer concede that the project clarified English expectations about epic style and narrative drive. So in short, Pope's Homer is a long form essay in a critical meditation, what counts as a sameness across languages and एजेस पर्टिक्युलरली, राईट. सो त्याने जे कॉन्ट्रीब्युशन आहे त्याला जरी क्रिटिकली सिव्हिअर झालं की तो एकदम ऑगस्टियन टिपिकल स्टाईलमध्ये लिहिलेला आहे असं जरी क्रिटिसिझम केलेलं असलं तरी अलेक्झांडर पोपने जे त्याच्या एसेमध्ये मांडलेलं आहे होमरच्या ट्रान्सलेशनबद्दल ते खरंच नोटवर्दी आहे आणि त्याच्यामुळे अनेक पुढच्या काळातल्या इंग्लिश ऑथर्सला, इंग्लिश रायटर्सला, पोएट्सला किंवा एक जनरल ऑडियन्सला याचा फायदा झालेला दिसतो किंवा त्याचं टेस्टिंग करून दिसतं. वी ऑल्सो फाइंड हिम एडिटिंग द शेक्सपियर्स वर्क and particularly highlighting on editing principles and pitfalls particularly. So in a way we find Pope's edition of Shakespeare's highlights to purify the text and regularize the spelling and the punctuation. Also it works to remove what he deemed the spurious or corrupt lines particularly, right? So when it comes to criticize Shakespeare being a classical or a prominent classical figure, we find him particularly editing it in such a way that it will enhance the taste of work produced by William Shakespeare, right? So adding various punctuation, removing certain things that are in a way corrupt lines according to him. So we also find him marking the doubtful passages with an asterisk and attempts to restore sense via conjecture. So in a way, he tries to correlate them and tries to make it more sensible and understanding for the people particularly. Okay, so he when it comes to criticize his work of editing Shakespeare's work, What is noteworthy is that his respect for the authorial intention, that filtered through the neoclassical decorum, and second is his confidence in the editor's tasteful judgment to correct perceived barbarism. Okay. No, when it came to so हा सगळ्यात मोठा फॅक्टर त्याने इथे मेंटेन केलेला दिसतो. म्हणजे काय, तर जो ऑथरल इंटेन्शन आहे त्याला कुठेही धक्का न लावता त्याच्या ट्रान्सलेशन त्याच्या एडिटिंगमध्ये काटछाट न करता सिम्पल लँग्वेजमध्ये वोकॅब्युलरीनं चेंज करता पर्टिक्युलर वेळी त्याचं एडिटेशन असावं जेणेकरून ते कॉमन लँग्वेजमध्ये कॉमन ऑडियन्सला इझिली रीड करता येईल किंवा त्यांना ॲक्सेसिबल असेल. नाव when the modern editors literally create neat. So later on, we find him being criticized for his not maintaining the neatness or the readiness to amend line. Okay, but his episodes are quite instructive and they reveal a methodological fault line between test-based emendation and historical textual scholarship. So his edition, even in its shortcomings, though there are several faults, it helps to professionalize the editorial debate and accelerate the movement toward evidential philology, particularly. सो त्याच्या ट्रान्सलेशनचं काम एडिटिंगचं काम सुद्धा इतक्या चपकलपणे आहे त्याला त्याच्या काळामध्ये अवेलेबल असणाऱ्या रिसोर्सेसच्या मदतीने कॉन्टॅक्टच्या मदतीने त्याने जे काही एडिटिंगचं काम केलं हे खूप प्रचंड अनुवर्दी आहे त्यामुळे पुढच्या काळामध्ये सुद्धा त्याचं ॲप्रिसिएशन आहे जरी त्याच्या एडिटिंगमध्ये because we try to assess the work of edition by Alexander Pope with the vision of our modern thinking, but when it comes to keep ourselves in the shoes of those neoclassical identities and try to find out what kind of the greatest contribution he has done, we definitely are going to find the work done by Alexander Pope quite noteworthy otherwise, right? So this kind of done is there. Uh, so let us understand the core doctrines of Pope's criticism, the core elements of Pope's criticism particularly. So we find him defining this very analogy that imitation and originality. For Pope, imitation is apprenticeship and not servility, as I said again. So when you, as he said previously in his one of the explanations, that when it comes to test the literature that originated in the that originated from the classics, particularly the classicals they referred, the Roman classics and Greek classics and kind of a literature produced in those classical eras. He says that the taste of that literature should be taken not just only with the with the purpose of mere imitation, but it has to be with uh, beyond the imitation, where you take it as an apprenticeship. Apprenticeship means where you focus with the purpose of studying it. So when it comes to study, you study it's a genre, it's a form, it's a style, it's a decorum, it's a language, it's a characterization, it's a dialogue formation, setting, theme. So many things are there that you try to cover up in an apprenticeship manner. So he doesn't want the work tested should be used only for kind of a mere imitation, particularly. Okay, so when he says to study the ancients, okay, the modern learns to articulate nature's permanent forms. That's what his opinion is that. So whatever the natural forms are there, those natural forms are particularly articulated by imitating, by following the ancient works, particularly that's what it says. So when it comes to understand the originality, so the epic will look like an epic, an elegy will look like an elegy, so a lyric will look like an lyric, particularly. So he condemns both slavish copying and ruthless innovation. So we find him definitely criticizing severely, both the lavish copying and ruthless innovation, particularly. Ruthless innovation means where you have had no taste and immediately you got up one day and started writing a poetry or lyric or ballad. It is of a no taste particular, it is of a no sense particular. That's what he states here. म्हणजे कुठल्याही माहितीच्या आधारावरती कुठल्याही वाचनाच्या आधाराशिवाय केलं गेलेलं साहित्य निर्मिती ही अतिशय कृत्रिम किंवा अतिशय कमकुवत दर्जाची असते. अशा प्रकारचं उपनयन इथे अलेक्झांडर पोप करताना दिसतो आणि ते करत असताना तो सिव्हिअरली या सगळ्या गोष्टींना क्रिटिसाइज सुद्धा करताना दिसतो particularly, right? So further part of his explanation is that decorum and proportion. Okay, so he says that the genres that we follow are the social contracts, particularly. For example, let's say whether it's epic, whether it's a satire, pastoral, and ode, all those maintain a fit between matter and style, particularly. So violations can be strategically fruitful, but only if the poet knows the rules being inverted particularly. So when he wrote mock epic particularly, he had that very idea that a kind of a, this is rather appreciated. So he has written a mock epic, a mock heroic epic. So an epic is something, a long narrative poem describing a kind of a great event or some sort of an adventure particularly. When it is an heroic epic, that heroic epic or an couplet with heroic epic, an epic with heroic couplet rather, I'm sorry, has a subject matter of a great adventures by the powerful or adventurous personalities particularly. So this makes kind of a great sense when we try to understand. No, so he says that when it is observed particularly, it should not be just like a mere imitation, right? So the style and matter has to be. जेव्हा तुम्ही ते व्हायलेट करताय, जेव्हा तुम्ही ओव्हरलुक करताय, जेव्हा तुम्ही त्यांना साईड साईड कॉर्नर करताय, तेव्हा ते साईड कॉर्नर करत असताना त्याच्या मागचा जो ग्रेट पर्पज आहे तो त्यातून रिफ्लेक्ट व्हायला हवा, की ज्यामुळे त्या ग्रेट पर्पजमुळे तुमचं व्हायलेशन कुठं ना कुठेतरी झाकलं जाईल, राईट. So this emphasis makes Pope's criticism less, you know, prescriptive than architectural. So you know, uh, so he tries to put forth. त्याने जे सांगितले ना की म्हणजे व्हायलेशन नसावं, पण ते व्हायलेशन करत असताना कशा प्रकारचं करावं, तर ते कशा प्रकारचं करत असताना कशा प्रकारचं करावं हे सांगत असताना आपण त्याचं हे एपिक मात्र विसरायला नको. ओके, जेव्हा तो इकडे ओपिनियन, जेव्हा तो इकडे स्टेट करतोय दॅट व्हायलेशन कॅन बी स्ट्रॅटेजिकली फ्रुटफुल बट ओनली इफ द पोएट नोज द रूल्स बिंग इन्व्हर्टेड पर्टिक्युलरली. जर का त्या कवीला त्या रूल्स बद्दल माहिती असेल, एपिकच्या क्वालिटी म्हणजे कुठल्याही फॉर्मच्या क्वालिटी बद्दल माहिती असेल, तर त्यानं ते करावं. आणि मग ते करत असताना कशा स्टाईलनी करावं, तर त्याने त्याच्या द रेप ऑफ लॉक या एपिकमध्ये मॉक हेरोइक कपलेट इन्क्लुडिंग एपिकमध्ये केलेलं दिसतं, राईट. We also find him prominently focusing on clarity and correctness. So he wants his so Pope in a way Pope in a way Alexander Pope we find propagating, you know, the perspicacity or grammatical propriety and cadence particularly. So according to him, in a way, correctness particularly is not a pedantry but ethical. The obscurity wastes the reader's time particularly. So in a way he wanted that grammatically correct, following the form, त्या फॉर्मला सूट असणारं तुमची लँग्वेज स्टाईल, त्या फॉर्मला सूट असणारी लँग्वेज आहे म्हणजे यूज ऑफ इनवर्जन और म्हणजे ग्रामॅटिकल करेक्टनेस, कॉन्टेक्च्युअल करेक्टनेस आणि त्याचा लॉजिकल प्रेझेंटेशन त्या कामाला जास्त रीडर ॲक्सेसिबल बनवतं, अशा प्रकारचं त्याचं मत आहे. जर का तुम्ही त्यामध्ये ऑब्स्क्युरिटी ठेवली तर त्या रीडरचा टाइम वेस्ट होतो आणि त्यामुळे ते वाचन, you know, that reading doesn't remain that fruitful according to the point of view of a reader. So Alexander Pope here we find advocating that the correctness and decorum matters the most particularly. So it should come up with some sort of clarity. Your obscurity or your ambiguity may lead to the readers, you know, in the thought that they have wasted their time particularly. So you know, we find him his handling of those couplets in a fantastic way when it comes to read the Fairy Queenie or Rape of Lock or maybe Dunciad, where we find him, you know, in a way severely criticizing the false authors or writers particularly, right. In addition to that, he also makes his opinion about judgment and education of taste. So he proposes a kind of a pedagogy, right. So he expects us, pedagogy means he comes up with his own teaching styles. Okay, so in a way he goes in a way he goes into a role of a teacher, right. Particularly आता इथे काय दिसतंय तर इकडे पोप आता एका टीचरच्या रोलमध्ये जातोय. म्हणजे काय तर तो क्रिटिसिझम कसं असावं हे सुद्धा शिकवतोय. म्हणजे क्रिटिक्सने काय करावं, क्रिटिक्सच्या ड्युटीज काय आहेत, तर तो एक पेडागॉजी प्रपोज करतो. म्हणजे काय पेडागॉजी सांगते, राईट. तर तो काय सांगतो की ही सेज, वी फाइंड हिम सेटिंग दॅट, read widely, compare, distrust extremes, submit tests to correction by exemplary works and intelligent peers particularly, right. So जेव्हा तुम्ही एखादं काम तयार कराल, right, so prior to that you have to have a habit of reading widely, right. So he says again, so it should not be because it will otherwise come up with a mere imitation but not an apprenticeship. जेव्हा तुम्ही जुन्या क्लासिकल क्वालिटी वर्कची टेस्ट घ्यायला जाताय ना, तेव्हा तुमच्याकडे तो तितका अप्रोच असायला हवा की जेणेकरून तुमचं रिडिंग इतकं वाईड आहे की त्या वाईड रेंज ऑफ रिडिंग्समधून तुमच्यामध्ये आपोआप त्या क्वालिटीज इन अ वे इम्पार्ट झालेल्या आहेत. सो बाय दॅट वॉट एव्हर यू प्रोड्यूस, you know it's been produced only as a quality kind of a work, right? So he has asked, to read widely, then he has asked to compare, why there has to be a kind of a valid comparison. जे लिहिले ते इतरांसोबत compare करा. Okay, and he says that whatever extremes are there, distrust them. That means not don't believe in your extreme amount of excitement unnecessarily until and unless it is governed by the rules. And he says submit tests to correction by exemplary works and intelligent peers. So whoever intelligent peers means a kind of a equal thought processing group you have around you. अशा ग्रुप सोबत की जो ग्रुप तुमच्यासारख्याच विचारांनी पुढे प्रेरित होऊन लिहितोय किंवा त्याचं काम हे तितक्या लेवलला इंटेलिजंट आहे. सो अशा लोकांना तुम्ही डेफिनेटली रेफर करा, अशा लोकांना तुम्ही इन अ वे प्रोपोगेट करा. So it makes kind of a great sense to understand what kind of ideology we find him uh, propagating over here, right? And he regards criticism as a communal improvement rather than solitary pronouncement, right? So तुम्ही रायटरच्या ऑथरच्या कम्युनिटीला क्रिटिसाइज, ऑथरच्या कम्युनिटीलाच स्ट्रेंथन करत आहात, कारण तुमचं काम हे कुठल्या एका इंडिव्हिज्युअल कामासाठी नसून ते काम अजून बाकीचे नाही. म्हणजे जेव्हा एखादा क्रिटिक एखाद्या ऑथरच्या कामाला क्रिटिसाइज करतो तेव्हा तो त्या इंडिव्हिज्युअल ऑथरला पॉईंट आउट न करता रीडर्स कम्युनिटीच्या पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यूने तो क्रिटिसाइज करतो. कारण देअर फर्दर रीडर्स, देअर फर्दर ऑथर्स, there are further prominent literary who are going to refer to the criticism and a kind of a work done by the author. So in a way, when such a kind of references are added particularly, it is quite important to listen to Pope, that this individual solitary आयडेंटिफिकेशन पेक्षा कम्युनल आयडेंटिफिकेशन असावं, जेणेकरून तुम्ही त्या कम्युनिटीचा, रीडर्स कम्युनिटीचा विचार करता किंवा रायटर्स कम्युनिटीचा विचार करता, राईट? Again, we find Pope making one more addition to that, that he expects kind of a morals of criticism, right? And so what morals a critic has to follow? That, candor, humility, and benevolence. Benevolence means where he is voluntarily doing it, right? And not ancillary. In a commercial culture where reputations can be manufactured, ethical criticism preserves the conditions for literature's public value, particularly, right? So when there is a commercialization, when there is a commercialization of criticism, right kind of, a kind of a quality critics could be promoted, and accordingly he says that when this commercial critical culture will develop, reputation can be manufactured, right? Critics automatically build reputations because they have become commercialized, and there will be a group of people who will be definitely in a way creating the reputation of those commercial critics on a paid version particularly. But keeping in mind, this benevolence, right? Your volunteering, your voluntary criticism will be always appreciated, and it will be an ethical criticism preserves the conditions for the literature's public value. And whatever public value the literature has in society, it has to be maintained with kind of a voluntary service provided by those critics particularly. So kind of an ethical criticism we find him defining over here in a way, in a very particular way, otherwise, right? So one more thing to discuss, particularly his work particularly, and what he had titled. Okay, this an essay on a man exercises the critic's art by integrating didactic content with poetic harmony. Okay, fine. So it gives kind of a brief account of whatever Pope had in a way tried to do in his whole lifespan particularly, and the way he tried to instruct the readers to on how to recalibrate the value particularly through his mock epic, as a diagnostic tool, then his Dunciad and the economy of attention particularly, and kind of a admiration he received. So he the various reactions on his works, how he has been referred by Coleridge, um, who referred him as the master of poetic diction, particularly, and the Homeric liberties is that how from romantic verdict, the 20th century critics like T.S. Eliot also and Maynard Mack, re-specifying the Pope's achievements particularly, and he has not been considered a minor versifier. So overall, we find that Alexander Pope remains one of the prominent figure in case of understanding the role of critics in neoclassical and Enlightenment age, particularly. Okay, and thus we find him as one of the prominent figures only because a kind of an adjustment he has made over here and a kind of a style he has developed over here makes him kind of a great, noteworthy critic, not just a critic but kind of a great literary that has produced kind of a great literature through the skills, right? And from the early age we find him possessing the test of literature. His attitude gets developed. So overall, in a way, that makes him kind of a great author, not just an author or poet, but particularly kind of a great critic too. So त्यामुळे अलेक्झांडर पोपचं काम समजून घेणं अत्यंत महत्त्वाचं आहे. जेव्हा आपण निओ क्लासिकल एज बघतो, निओ क्लासिकल एज मधलं अलेक्झांडर पोपचं काम बघतो, so we have to literally pay attention at a kind of a thoughts that he had shared with the various works, and they have to be studied, and they are not just studied by his contemporary, they were not studied only by his contemporary colleagues, the contemporary writers and authors then, but also in the in the descendant time, in the descendant phase, we also have find him appreciated by the romantic, uh, uh, in the age of romantic criticism, in the age of Victorian criticism, and also in the further critical styles or in the modern world also. So that was all about Alexander Pope. Let us go and discuss about one of the prominent figures, which inclines towards a bit romantic approach, not completely in a romantic age, but again, in a way, one of the prominent figure, that is Dr. Samuel Johnson, who remains, in a way, one of the series on literary criticism and theories, particularly. We are talking about the classical and Renaissance age critics. Half an hour, just before a minute ago, for half an hour, we have talked about the greatest contribution by Alexander Pope and the kind of a great contribution he has made. Now, what comes to next our mind, the prominent figure of English literature, particularly who is considered as the canon of English literature, is none other than Dr. Samuel Johnson, who is also a kind of was also kind of a multi-talented personality. He was quite a great poet, essayist. He has written essays. He has written poems. He has prepared a dictionary. Has put his thoughts on criticism, and a fellow, belonging to UK, particularly giving his kind of a greatest contribution in English literature, and later on, greatly awarded with the Law Royal Pension for his kind of a greatest contribution. So we find him kind of one of the prominent personalities. Let's go and try to understand about such a great person otherwise, right? So to uh, So we have with us Dr. Samuel Johnson, who remains as one of the most, kind of a formidable personalities in literary criticism. His a contribution, we know him for the greatest contribution as a poet, lexicographer, and a moralist. His role as a literary critic is left an enduring legacy, particularly. His insights on literature, particularly, were not confined to abstract theory, but were deeply, rooted in moral reflections, the practical judgment, and close reading. Right. So he helped to define the standards of literary taste in 18th century, and his works continue in a way to they continue to resonate for their balance, clarity, and depth. right? So what was the nature of his criticism particularly? Unlike many other critics, who grounded their work in a philosophical or in a political theory, Johnson's criticism we find, he was shaped by the common sense, the moral seriousness, and empirical observation. He was kind of a great observer otherwise, right? We do not find him that much interested in literary criticism, as purely in an academic pursuit, uh, because Johnson's, because for him, literature had a moral purpose, as he held, though he is one of the prominent figures in the end of neoclassical era, we can say, but his idea or his greatest amount of possession for the moralistic approach of literature is kind of noteworthy that he goes on, particularly propagating in a way. So he had a thought that it should educate, it should teach, and it should reflect the universal truths of human nature. And so we find him severely accepting or coming in support with the thought of William Shakespeare, where he was greatly criticized, right? So let us see the various angles of the criticism technicalities of Dr. Samuel Johnson. Okay, he's a moral purpose of literature. He firmly believed that literature should offer moral instructions. He did not support art for art's sake. Okay, and for him, good literature reflects the moral and psychological truths of human conditions, and so he praised the writers who dealt with virtue, vice, and ambition, folly, and other timeless themselves. So, keeping in light with the opinion that's shared by Aristotle in his Poetics, we find that when he tried to write over what Plato had stated, that art is nothing but mere imitation, and in a way to counter that argument, or not directly to counter the argument, but to come up with more explanation on imitation. Aristotle had said that life is not, literature is nothing but the lifelike representation of human society. Lifelike representation of a society. A man has to be described like a man. A human has to be presented like a human. And so, in a way, we find him somewhere, Samuel Johnson, being that pursuing the moral purpose of society, right? So the literature, its basic purpose is to teach, to instruct, to delight, and in a way, so he is of an opinion that literature has to be written with some sort of an instruction. So it have to have an instructive way. So जेव्हा कधी एखादं साहित्य निर्मिती केली जाते, तेव्हा त्या साहित्य निर्मितीमधून समाजाला काही ना काहीतरी बोध मिळावा, प्रत्यक्ष किंवा अप्रत्यक्षरित्या, किंवा ते फक्त एखादी कादंबरी लिहायची म्हणून लिहिलं नाही. इट शुड नॉट बी लाईक आर्ट सेक. अशा प्रकारचं काइंड ऑफ लिटरेचर ते नसावं, पण त्यातून काही ना काहीतरी समाजासमोर येणारं, समाजाला समजावून सांगणारं, असं काही ना काहीतरी फोकसफुल काम त्यामध्ये नक्की असावं. अशा प्रकारचं ओपिनियन आपण इकडे दिसतं की हे त्याच्या क्रिटिकल थिअरीचा प्रॉमिनंटली अप्रोच होता. तो म्हणून त्याने मग जे समाजातल्या सगळ्या घटकांना इन अ वे समोर उभा करून, समाजातल्या सर्व स्तरातल्या लोकांना समोर उभा करून त्यांची मांडणी साहित्यातून करतात. अशा लेखकांचं कौतुक करताना आपल्याला डॉक्टर सॅम्युअल जॉन्सन दिसतात, राईट. अँड सो वी फाइंड हिज अगेन वन ऑफ दी prominent attribute of his critical ideas is that the faith in universal human nature, right? So he trusted, the great literature that captures the truth that are constant across time and culture, particularly, right? So the heroes to be present like a hero, history has to be explained in literature, particularly. So the historical topics, heroic topics, in a way, or the social strata that are presented. Okay, so he admired authors like Shakespeare, who depicted the characters and emotions that transcended their historical moment, particularly. So त्या काळामधल्या इतिहासातल्या घडलेल्या गोष्टींना अनुरूप असलेले असे पात्र आपण कसे उभा करू शकतो, तर तसे पात्र उभा केले जात आहेत का? राजे महाराजे, म्हणजे समजा हा राजा महाराजांचा काळ आहे, तर राजे महाराजे दाखवले जात आहेत का? त्यानंतर त्या ठिकाणी असणारे सेनापती, सरसेनापती, किंवा एक सामान्य जनता, प्रजा, त्याचं जे काही रिफ्लेक्शन आहे, आणि तशा प्रकारच्या वागणूक म्हणजे इन अ वे there are people in society. There are not always moralistic people in society or wise people. Society is not full of only with wise people, particularly. So, as we know that there are people who betray, there are people who deceive, there are people who kill, there are people, who are, possessed with heinous acts, particularly. So the way the society is full of with these many people, there are who are innocent, there are who are quite fool, there are who are quite clever, there are who are quite there are who those are quite in a way smart. So Shakespeare had this quality to represent the characters picking up from directly the society, right? So that's why Dr. Samuel Johnson finds Shakespeare's work quite noteworthy because he had a faith in universal human nature. So across the time and culture, we find that humans are like that, right? So it has to be taken into consideration, and accordingly, kind of a literature has to be produced. Is a kind of opinion we find Dr. Samuel Johnson propagating over here very, in a way, uh, particularly, right? So this makes kind of a greater sense otherwise, right? Then further we have is the empirical and pragmatic judgment. So he resisted the rigid aesthetic theories and classical rules particularly. Instead, he evaluated literature based on effect, clarity, and truthfulness to the experience. So he had a little patience for overly obscure or artificially complex writing, right? So जे लिखाण रीडर्सच्या सहज म्हणजे रीडर्स जे लिखाण वाचनीय आहेच, पण ते वाचनीय असण्यापूर्वी समजायला सोपं आहे. त्यातून मांडलेल्या संकल्पना, त्यातून उभी केलेली पात्र, त्यातून समोर आणलेली थीम जी लोकांच्या सहजगत्या लक्षात येईल, राईट? एका वन गो मध्ये त्यांच्या लक्षात येईल, अँड दे आर एबल टू अंडरस्टँड द काइंड ऑफ अ ग्रेटेस्ट कॉन्ट्रीब्युशन ऑफ दॅट पर्टिक्युलर ऑथर. सो इन अ वे वी फाइंड हिम being quite noteworthy in case of explaining certain things, right? सो सॅम्युएल जॉन्सनचा ॲक्सेप्टन्स हा अशा लिटरेचरकडे नव्हता की जे थोडंसं कॉम्प्लेक्सनेस देतं किंवा जे ऑब्स्क्युरिटी सांगतं, राईट? व्हॉट इट सेज दॅट he resisted rigid aesthetic theories and classical rules, right? Instead, he evaluated literature based on its effect. What effect of literature is there? What literary form, what kind of impact it is making? How clear it is? What kind of clarity it has? Exactly. The clarity can be achieved by the style and language. So, what kind of language is used? What kind of style is used? And a truthfulness to experience. What experience? So, when it comes to experience the reading, the utmost truthfulness has to be there. So, he had a little patience for overly obscure or art artificially complex writing, right? सो ओढून ताडून कुठेतरी कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी आणलेलं किंवा त्याला थोडंसं जडत्व आणलेलं जे काही प्रकारचं लेखन असतं ना, अशा प्रकारच्या लेखनला शक्यतो टाळताना म्हणजे ते टाळलं जावं अशा प्रकारच्या मताचा डॉक्टर सॅम्युएल जॉन्सनचा अप्रोच दिसतो, राईट? लेट अस गो अँड फाइंड आउट हिज अ मेजर क्रिटिकल वर्क्स नाव, पर्टिक्युलरली इन विच वी हॅव सीन हिज अ ग्रेटेस्ट अमाऊंट ऑफ कॉन्ट्रीब्युशन. तर सगळ्यात पहिलं कुठलं आहे, तर ते आहे प्रिफेस टू शेक्सपियर. ओके, ते पब्लिश झालं होतं 1765ला. प्रिफेस टू शेक्सपियर काय आहे, तेव्हा त्यांनी शेक्सपियरच्या एडिशन्सवरती काम करायला सुरुवात केली. तेव्हा त्या एडिशन्सच्या अगोदर लिहिला गेलेला एक जो एसे आहे किंवा लिहिला गेलेला जो एक राईटअप आहे, तो राईटअप म्हणजे काय, तर प्रिफेस टू शेक्सपियर. बिफोर ही वॉन्टेड टू स्टार्ट विथ दी एडिटिंग वर्क ऑफ विलियम शेक्सपियर, he had come up with his writing, he had come up with his thoughts that he put in compilation. So this big write-up is called as Preface to Shakespeare, which is an introduction to his edition on Shakespeare's plays. Okay, particularly, and it offers us a kind of a comprehensive evaluation of Shakespeare's achievements and shortcomings particularly. So यामध्ये फक्त शेक्सपियरच्या अचिव्हमेंट्स बद्दलच न बोलता शेवटी शेवटी त्यांनी शेक्सपियरनी काय करायला हवं, शेक्सपियरच्या शॉर्टकमिंग्स कुठल्या कुठल्या आहेत, फ्लॉज कुठले कुठले आहेत, याबद्दल सुद्धा बॅलन्स्ड वेनी आपलं ओपिनियन शेअर केलेलं दिसतं. So let us go and try to find out what are the key arguments that are made by Samuel Johnson. Shakespeare as the poet of nature is the prominent point he makes over here, right? So he praises William Shakespeare's deep understanding of human nature, and so he says that directly that Shakespeare is above all writers, at least above all modern writers, the poet of nature. So defines him the poet of nature. So he writes about him, and for him, Shakespeare's characters were not mere types but individuals drawn with psychological realism, right? And definitely, we also, when we come across few of the writings by him, particularly highlighting the Iago presented, the way he presented Iago in Othello, or the way he presented Macbeth in Macbeth and the pursuits of Lady Macbeth in a way, or the hallucination thought or kind of the chasing thought of Bonko. In a way, these various characterizations are noteworthy, definitely, as we have just talked about them. Likewise, we have seen डॉक्टर सॅम्युएल जॉन्सन ऑल्सो फाइंडिंग द सेम. म्हणून सॅम्युएल जॉन्सन काय म्हणतात की शेक्सपियरचं जे पात्र रंगवण्याचं जे कौशल्य होतं ना, किंवा त्याचे पात्र जे रंगवले गेले आहेत ना, ती अशा प्रकारे रंगवले गेले आहेत की ते समाजामध्ये असणाऱ्या अस्तित्वाचं भान करून देतात, की अशा प्रकारची पात्र समाजात देखील सुद्धा आहेत. राईट. He's a superiority of characterizations over a plot. Many of the times, no, William Shakespeare is criticized for not observing all the three unities, that is, unity of time, unity of place, unity of action, particularly. So his plots are not considered a structured plot, but Dr. Samuel Johnson claims that his characterization is something that overpowers the shortcoming of plot. So what he says here, see, he acknowledges that Shakespeare's plots were often improbable or loosely constructed, but he argued that Shakespeare's genius lay in his creation of compelling, believable characters, which was a greater artistic achievement. Right, and definitely it's not just only Samuel Johnson, but the further many critics too have appreciated the greatest of the greatest skill of characterization of William Shakespeare, particularly. शेक्सपियरचं मगाशी म्हणल्याप्रमाणे जे पात्र रंगवण्याचं, पात्र उभं करण्याचं जे कौशल्य होतं ना, ते त्याच्या कथानकाला, म्हणजे जो प्लॉट होता शेक्सपियरच्या प्लेटचा प्लॉट हा लूज किंवा नॉट वेल कन्स्ट्रक्टेड प्लॉट असं म्हणून त्याला लेबलाइज केलं जातं अनेक क्रिटिक्सकडून. पण डॉक्टर सॅम्युएल जॉन्सन म्हणतात की तुम्ही त्याच्या प्लॉटकडे लक्ष न देता त्याच्या कॅरेक्टरायझेशनकडे लक्ष द्या, की जे कॅरेक्टरायझेशन खरंच नोटवर्दी, आणि अशा प्रकारचं कॅरेक्टरायझेशन स्किल्स हे कुठल्या इतर ड्रामॅटिस्टमध्ये, प्ले राईटमध्ये सापडत नाही आपल्याला. त्यामुळे ते खूप महत्त्वाचं आहे. And he has defended him against neoclassical critics. So he rejected the neoclassical instances on the unities of time, place, and action. He argued that these were artificial constraints that did not reflect the complexity of life or the freedom of imagination. Right. So या नियमांच्या मागे तितकं धावण्यापेक्षा जी सामाजिक सत्यता आहे, समाजामधलं खरं सत्य मानलं जात आहे, समाजामधले खरे पात्र तशाच्या तशा प्रकारचे पात्र उभे केले जातात, ते उभे करत असताना अशा प्रकारच्या काही गोष्टींना बगल द्यावी लागते. म्हणजे काय, ऑब्झर्वन्स ऑफ युनिटीज कॅन बी केप्ट असाइड इन केस ऑफ फ्रेमिंग समथिंग ग्रेट अँड क्रिएटिव्हिटी. So in a way we find that somewhere he is keeping the neoclassical ideologies or neoclassical rules somewhere aside and trying to propagate the greatness of William Shakespeare. Okay, so this thing is there particularly. And one of the prominent characteristics of Dr. Jamil Johnson's criticism is the balanced criticism, particularly, right? So why his criticism is a balanced criticism? He did not blindly reverent for William Shakespeare, particularly. He openly criticized the Shakespeare's vulgar language, indecent jokes, and occasional moral ambiguity. Okay, so we find this tells us that the balanced praise and critic marked a significant advance in English literary criticism, and this put forth by particularly Dr. Samuel Johnson otherwise, right? So this kind of a contribution is definitely noteworthy when it comes to understand the role. So प्रिफेस टू शेक्सपियरमध्ये आपल्याला काय काय बघायला मिळतं, तर शेक्सपियरच्या केलेल्या कामाचं कौतुक दिसतं, पण त्याचबरोबर शेक्सपियरचे वल्गर डायलॉग्स किंवा शेक्सपियरचे इनडिसेंट जोक किंवा ऑकेजनल अँबिग्विटी जी होती, ओके, मॉरल अँबिग्विटी जी दिसते, त्यामधून शेक्सपियरच्या काही दोषांवर सुद्धा प्रकाश टाकलेला आपल्याला दिसतो. कुणाकडून तर डॉक्टर सॅम्युएल जॉन्सन यांच्याकडनं. त्यामुळे एक एक बॅलन्स, एक संतुलित क्रिटिसिझम कसं असावं, बॅलन्स क्रिटिसिझम कसं असावं, याचं उत्तम उदाहरण म्हणजे कोण असेल तर डॉक्टर सॅम्युएल जॉन्सन आहेत. त्यांचं पुढचं एक अत्यंत महत्त्वाचं काम आहे म्हणजे लाईव्स ऑफ इंग्लिश पोएट्स. ओके, सो दिस इज अ मॅसिव्ह बायोग्राफिकल अँड क्रिटिकल वर्क which comprises essays on 52 poets, that range from John Dryden to which range from John Dryden to Thomas Gray. It is considered as a landmark in literary biography, and it is a treasure of literary critical insights, particularly. So, what are the key contribution of those? Let's go and read them. Integration of life and work. So, he pioneered the method of connecting writers' life to their literary output. He believed that understanding the poet's personal experiences helped explain their artistic choices, particularly. Right. सो गोईंग इन टू डीपर, त्या पोएटच्या लाईफमध्ये काय घडलं, त्या पोएटच्या आयुष्यात काय काय चढउतार आले, या सगळ्यांचा अंदाज घेणं या सगळ्यांची माहिती घेणं हे त्याच्या केलेल्या कामाच्या इव्हॅल्युएशनमध्ये समहाव मदत करतं किंवा त्याच्या चॉईसेसवर इम्पॅक्ट करतं. अशा प्रकारचं ओपिनियन इकडे डॉक्टर सॅम्युएल जॉन्सन करतात, राईट. तर त्यामुळे मग कुठल्याही ऑथरला जज करत असताना त्याच्या लाईफबद्दल, त्याच्या बायोग्राफीबद्दल थोडंफार माहिती असणं गरजेचं आहे, जेणेकरून त्याच्या लिखाणाच्या स्टाईलबद्दल, त्याच्या लिखाणाच्या लँग्वेजबद्दल, त्याच्या कॅरेक्टरायझेशनबद्दल एक आयडिया आपल्यामध्ये डेव्हलप होते. अँड बाय दॅट वी आर एबल टू इव्हॅल्युएट द वर्क क्वाईट नो or able to test the work quite sincerely, right? Further, he says about judgment and test. So he was not afraid to make a strong critical judgment, particularly. So he famously criticized the metaphysical poets, especially John Donne, for yoking the heterogeneous ideas by violence together. So he favored clarity and harmony over intellectual connections. Okay, so he was of a opinion that a common man may feel how relatable these things can to me, how these things are quite relatable to me particularly. So मग ते रिलेटेबल आहेत का, मग असतील तर त्यामध्ये काय महत्त्वाचं आहे. त्यामुळे या गोष्टी समजून घेऊन मेटाफिजिकल पोएट्सला क्रिटिक करत होतं की तो इंटेलेक्च्युअली अपिलिंग आहेत का, तर आहेत, पण त्यापेक्षा पलीकडे काय आहे, द क्लॅरिटी अँड हार्मनी ओव्हर इंटेलेक्च्युअल कॉन्ट्रॉशन. सो इंटेलेक्च्युअल कॉन्ट्रॉशनच्या अगेन्स्ट काय गरजेचं आहे, तर त्याची क्लॅरिटी आणि हार्मनी ज्यातून ती एक्सप्रेस होते तर ती मेंटेन केली जाते का ते बघावं. तो आपल्या कामांमधनं ते एक्सप्रेस करणार जास्त असावं, अशा प्रकारचं पण आहे. अँड कॅनन फॉर्मेशन, नो we find Dr. Samuel Johnson playing a key role, in shaping the English literary canon particularly. So his admiration for poets like Dryden, Pope, Milton, that helped to elevate those critics or those poets particularly as a central figures in English literary criticism. Right? सॅम्युएल जॉन्सन खूप फेमस झाले होते आणि सॅम्युएल जॉन्सनने जॉन ड्रायडन, जॉन मिल्टन, अलेक्झांडर पोप अशा प्रकारच्या सगळ्या ग्रेट लोकांच्या कामाचं कौतुक केल्यामुळे त्या लोकांना एक वेगळं महत्त्व प्राप्त झालं. आणि ऑब्व्हियसली जितकं महत्त्व सॅम्युएल जॉन्सनचं होतं की त्याच्याहून अधिक महत्त्व या सगळ्यांचं आहे, त्यामुळे यांच्या कामाला जास्त महत्त्व आहे. अशा प्रकारचं काम दिसतं लाईफ ऑफ पोएट मधनं ते रिफ्लेक्ट होतं. आणि पुढचा एक एलिमेंट आहे त्यामध्ये म्हणजे काहीतरी ॲक्सेसिबिलिटी टू क्रिटिसिझम. द लाईव्स वेर रिटन इन ल्युसिड एलिगंट प्रोज फार फ्रॉम academic jargon. This made Johnson's criticism readable and widely influential even beyond scholarly circles. Right? Again, as we say, we find him quite doing like Alexander Pope said. ज्याप्रमाणे अलेक्झांडर पोपने त्याच्या क्रिटिसिझम मध्ये एक्सप्लेन करत असताना क्रिटिसिझम कसं असावं ते सांगितलं. आणि थ्रू म्हणजे क्रिटिसिझम सांगत असताना एखादं लिटररी वर्क कसं असावं हे डिफाईन केलं. And by defining that work, he put forth an example by writing the Dunciad or Rape of Locke by using wit and satire all together in a heroic couplet way. Right? Likewise, not exactly likewise, my assimilation of them, Dr. Samuel Johnson and Alexander Pope would be quite strange over here. But Dr. Samuel Johnson also somewhere had not interest in great kind of an obscurity or ambiguity particularly. So as he himself didn't approach this kind of thought की म्हणजे ज्याप्रमाणे कुठलंही एकदम जडत्व असलेलं खूप कॉम्प्लेक्स रीतीने एक्सप्लेन केलेलं जे काही क्रिटिकल वर्क असतं किंवा जे काही लिटररी वर्क असतं त्याला थोडंसं साईड अँगल केलेलं दिसतं. आणि म्हणूनच लाईव्स ऑफ पोएट हे इतक्या सिम्पल, साध्या, सहज आणि वाचनीय भाषेत दिलं आहे. ओके, इट इज पुट फोर्थ इन सच अ सिम्पल ल्युसिड लँग्वेज that everybody feels like reading, and so it becomes most readable and the most influential kind of a work particularly. Okay, and so it was read widely and it become widely influential well particularly, right. Let us try to understand his critical method and style particularly. What was that? It was of a close reading and quotation. Johnson often supported his evaluations with specific textual evidences. So he was quite attentive to language, rhythm, then the diction and imagery particularly. And he anticipated the close reading methods of later critics like I.A. Richards and Cleveland Brooks can be anticipated. So close textual reading can be can be considered with him. So the quotation makes him quite aware. So जेव्हा तो कोट करतो ना तेव्हा ते जास्त ऑथेंटिक होतं आणि तेव्हा ते समजायला इझिली होतं. त्यामुळे त्याची ही स्टाईल सगळ्यात महत्त्वाची आहे. पुढचं काय महत्त्वाचं आहे तर ज्युडिशियस अँड बॅलन्स. So it is one of the greatest strengths as a critic, Dr. Samuel Johnson has, that was the fairness. Okay, he was neither idolized or condemned authors blindly. Okay, he did not accept the authors blindly. So even so, we find him, having this kind of approach. Even when it came to talk about Dr. Samuel John, Dr. When it came for Dr. Samuel Johnson to talk about William Shakespeare, त्यामुळे विल्यम शेक्सपियरला इकडे त्यांनी ब्लाइंडली कुठेही क्रिटिसाइज केलेलं आपल्याला दिसत नाही किंवा ब्लाइंड फॉन्डनिझम नाही. ओके, सो ही इज नॉट ब्लाइंडली फॉन्ड ऑफ द रायटिंग पर्टिक्युलरली. So he acknowledges merit when it is due, but also he strongly criticizes when it is required, particularly. For example, uh, when it comes to talk about metaphysical poetry that's strained and obscure, he recognized the Dunn's intellectual brilliance, particularly. Okay, metaphysical पोएटच्या ऑब्स्क्युरिटी बद्दल क्रिटिसाइज करत असताना तो जॉन डनच्या इंटेलिजन्स बद्दल सुद्धा प्रेज करताना दिसतो. Moral and intellectual seriousness. So he saw criticism as a serious moral enterprise, particularly. It's kind of a big serious business. It's a moral serious business. Criticism हे काही साधं सुद्धा किंवा हलकं फुलकं नाही किंवा सहज जात जात करावं असं नाहीये किंवा त्याच्या मागचा मेन पर्पज काय आहे. ही बिलीव्ड दॅट अ क्रिटिक शुड गाईड द रीडर्स टुवर्ड्स ट्रूथ. ओके, जेव्हा एखादा क्रिटिक एखादा गोष्ट क्रिटिसाइज करतो तेव्हा त्याच्या क्रिटिसिझमचा अप्रोच काय असावा, तर तो त्या रायटरला गाईड करणारा असावा, त्याला ब्युटी एक्सप्लेन करणारा असावा, व्हर्च्यू म्हणजे काय सांगणारा असावा, आणि इट शुड एंटरटेन देम मेअरली ऑर अनालाइज द स्ट्रक्चर, राईट. सो the again one of the prominent factor of the contribution of him is that his attitude towards the literary theory. Unlike the 20th century critics, Johnson did not build a formal theory or literature. Okay, he distrusted the abstract systems and favored case by case evaluation. He criticized overly theoretical approaches that neglected the actual enterprise experience of reading or moral effect of the literature. So जी केस सापडते ती केस घ्या, ते केस सॉल्व करा. So case to case study, we find him doing very prominently over here. Okay, so this pragmatic is evident in his commentary on poetic diction, where he criticizes oversimplicity and excessive ornament. So he opposes the poetic conventions that have become stale, and he values originality that tempered by clarity and purpose, particularly. So in a way, here we have a Samuel Johnson, in a way, who briefly talks about म्हणजे खरं तर इथे सॅम्युअल जॉन्सनचं जे काम आहे ना, तर म्हणजे इंग्लिश लिटररी कॅनन म्हणून ज्यांचा उल्लेख केला गेला, तर म्हणजे काय, तर शेक्सपियर, मिल्टन, ड्रायडन, पोप या सगळ्यांना एका इंग्लिश लिटरेचरमध्ये सेंट्रल फिगर कमवून देण्याचं काम कोणी केलं असेल तर ते सॅम्युअल जॉन्सनने आहे. कारण त्यांच्याबद्दल लिहून त्यांचं महत्त्व जगाला पटवून देण्याचं काम कोणी केलं तर डॉक्टर सॅम्युअल जॉन्सनने केलं. In a way, at the same time, we find him, he's a critical stamp, in a way, elevated, these authors to timeless status and influenced how literature was taught and studied in schools and universities, particularly. So सगळ्या युनिव्हर्सिटीजमध्ये, स्कूल्समध्ये जे काही लिटरेचर शिकवलं गेलं ना, त्या लिटरेचरमध्ये विल्यम शेक्सपियर, जॉन मिल्टन, जॉन रायडन, अलेक्झांडर पोप या सगळ्यांच्या कामाचा कुठे ना कुठेतरी प्रिस्क्रिप्शन दिसतं, त्यांचा अभ्यास केलेला दिसतो. तो अभ्यास करण्यामागे त्यांचं महत्त्व वाढवण्यामध्ये कोणाचं योगदान असेल तर ते आहे डॉक्टर सॅम्युअल जॉन्सन यांचं, राईट. So, what legacies we find, the foundation of English literary criticism, then his influence on biographical criticism, his anticipation of reader response and close reading, and the moral criticism, particularly, which was awakening, right? So, in a way, Dr. Samuel Johnson, in this brief introduction, we find him one of the prominent figures and is considered as the, one of the prominent figures in English literature in the medieval age, particularly in the 17th and 18th century, and being the prominent figure of Renaissance and Enlightenment age, particularly. So this was all about Dr. Samuel Johnson. Let's revise what we have been discussing so far, particularly. Yes, if it's right. सो हे होतं डॉक्टर सॅम्युअल जॉन्सन बद्दल. आता आपण न्यू क्लासिकल आणि एनलाइटनमेंट एराला एंड करत आहोत. यातले आपण 5 ते 6 प्रॉमिनंट फिगर्स बद्दल आपण अभ्यास केलेला आहे. तो म्हणजे जॉन ड्रायडन, त्यानंतर परत बेन जॉन्सन, त्यानंतर परत फिलिप सिडनी, त्यानंतर अलेक्झांडर पोप आणि आता डॉक्टर सॅम्युअल जॉन्सन. सो या प्रॉमिनंट फिगर्सच्या अभ्यासानंतर आता आपण पुढे वळणार आहोत ते म्हणजे काय तर रोमॅन्टिक एज पर्टिक्युलरली, आणि या रोमॅन्टिक एजमधल्या ग्रेटेस्ट कॉन्ट्रीब्युशनबद्दल. तर या रोमॅन्टिक एजमधल्या कुठल्या कुठल्या ऑथरनी काय काय कॉन्ट्रीब्युशन केलं. विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थ आहे, त्यानंतर पी.बी. शेली आहे, त्यानंतर परत एस.टी. कोलरिज आहे. या सगळ्यांच्या कामाचा इन अ वे काय आपल्याला आढावा घ्यायचा आहे ते बघूयात. आणि त्या काळामध्ये निओ क्लासिकल आयडियाजच्या एक्सेसिव्ह ॲक्सेस नंतर थोडंसं लिबर्टी, इमॅन्सिपेशन फ्रॉम रूल्स आणि ब्रिंगिंग दिस सब्जेक्ट मॅटर टू द कॉमन अँड इंडिव्हिज्युअल क्रिएटिव्हिटी या सगळ्याकडे जास्त व्हॅल्यू गेलेली दिसते. अशा प्रकारच्या वेगवेगळ्या क्वालिटीजनी गव्हर्न होणारा हा रोमॅन्टिक पिरियड आहे. आणि आपण या रोमॅन्टिक पिरियडबद्दल खरं तर पुढच्या लेक्चरमध्ये इन डिटेलमध्ये बघणार आहोत. आता फक्त हा तुमच्यासमोर ओव्हरव्ह्यू आहे की जो 18th सेंचुरीमध्ये दिसतो. म्हणजे जॉन ड्रायडन पासून ते जॉन्सन पर्यंतच्या न्यू क्लासिकल आणि एनलायटन एज नंतर खरं तर याच लोकांमधून पुढच्या रोमॅन्टिक आयडियाज एमर्ज होत गेल्या आणि त्या कुठेतरी सेट झाल्या. त्या सेट करण्याचं काम प्रॉमिनंटली कोणी केलं असेल तर ते विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थने आहे. त्यामुळे इमॅजिनेशन सब्जेक्ट और सब्जेक्टिव्हिटी या सगळ्या गोष्टींना महत्त्व वाढलं आणि त्यामुळे मग इमॅजिनेशन आणि इमोशन्सला जास्तीत जास्त प्रमाणामध्ये ओपिनियन देणारा असं एक लिटरेचर पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यू आलेलं दिसतं. So this is all about our today's session. In our upcoming session, as I said, we are going to talk about particularly the romantic age of criticism. Till then, have a very fantastic life ahead. Thank you very much.